Hello, everyone. I am Brian Gottlieb, and welcome to another Arena Decklist Deck Tech. I am back again with a tournament-proven deck. If you've been following our YouTube page, our social media, all that good stuff, you know that somehow I again won a Fandom Legends event. This one a little bit smaller event, the 8-person Caster Cup, still top flight competition. Tons of Hall of Famers, MPLers, all the good stuff. All doing their best to win a 5K, essentially, for 8 people. All bringing their best decks to the table. And this is the deck that came out on top. Something I'm calling either Giant Golos, BANT Golos. I'm cool with either one of those names. But as you might have guessed, we're returning to Field of the Dead strategies. My thought being, going into this tournament, number one, I didn't think I could play Esper Dance again. I felt like, given that it was a small field, everyone knew the participants ahead of time. There was some capacity to hard target the deck. I didn't want people to really account for what they thought I would be playing, so I wanted to switch things up a little bit. And you could see that come to fruition in some ways if you looked at Mike Sigrist's list from the event for Tamiyo main and his version of the Simic ramp deck. So it seems like people are starting to account for things like Esper. But I loved a lot about Esper. And one of the main things I loved about Esper was its ability to just cast Kaya's Wrath. I think having Wrath effects right now is incredibly impactful. They're super strong against all the Simic variations going around. So I knew I wanted something that had access to that game, but I also wanted something that could go over the top of anyone else who might have chosen to play Esper in the event. I didn't want to be super vulnerable to Doom Foretold. I wanted to make sure I had staying power against opposing Wraths, and man, did I find the right deck for this tournament. Honestly, it felt like I was on the next level. It felt like it would be challenging for me to lose in a lot of spots. A lot of my matchups were so good that it actually felt challenging for me not to win in some instances. Even despite many missteps along the way, many suboptimal plays, my deck was just there to bail me out. And going big with Golos is really appealing to me still right now because we're starting to see a resurgence in adventure style decks. Things like green-white adventures played by Reed Duke in the MPL, Jund adventures being popularized by Crokies. All these decks are starting to tick up in the metagame, and I think playing Golos is a great response to that. But let's get into the individual cards and see exactly what their roles are in this deck. Of course, any Field of the Dead deck is going to be built around its ramp package, and here you see kind of a small, petite ramp package. It's only 12 actual ramp spells being played, unless you want to count Golos in that category. You probably should. But our core is small but functional. It does exactly what we need to do. Arboreal Grazer going to hold the fort against any aggressive decks you might come up against. Growth Spiral, just good value. Beautiful Seth McKinnon art on this card as well. I was absolutely awestruck by it every time I see it. But drawing a card with your ramp spell just assures you have the resources to play the late game. And of course, Circuitous Route is that big burst of ramp that you need in the late game. Plays beautifully with something like Field of the Dead. If you have 5 different lands in play, including the Field of the Dead, you go find 2 new ones with Circuitous Route. You will, in fact, get 2 triggers from the Field of the Dead. It's just something to keep in mind. And speaking of our namesake card, we have a way to go get it reliably. It's Golos, Tireless Pilgrim. Golos is so interesting in this deck because its activated ability means your opponent absolutely must answer it. They cannot leave it on the battlefield. But honestly, when you play the games, you don't care if your Golos survives. Once it grabs a Field of the Dead from the deck, it has done its job. And it creates this horrible tension for your opponent where they really have no choice but to answer it. But it's not slowing down your game plan whatsoever, and it allows you to keep the snowball going. This is an incredible card, and it only gets better as time goes on in Standard and more lands get added to the mix. So keep your eye on Golos for a while. I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot more of this card. Then we go to our Wraths, and when I played Fandom, I had 4 Realm-Cloaked Giant. I since have picked up a Time Wipe, because 1, I like the synergy with Realm-Cloaked Giant. 2, I think people made some I would say concessions to the card Realm-Cloaked Giant in recent days. They are playing more drill bits as opposed to duress out of the mono black deck, so that helps them answer Realm-Cloaked Giant. And just as a pure Wrath, Time Wipe is certainly the better card than Realm-Cloaked Giant. The synergies are better on Realm-Cloaked Giant, though, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Finally, there's Hydroid Crisis. It's just the slam dunk in this deck. It lets you refill. You always feel like you have gas when you're playing these Golos decks. It's very hard to get to a position where you're out of resources. You just have to figure out how to combine your resources in the right way to find victory. And Hydroid Krasis does a lot to keep those flowing. Often is your end game. Being able to fly over battlefields that get bogged down, very, very impactful. It used to be I was comfortable playing fewer copies of Hydroid Krasis in ramp strategies back when you had Scape Shift. Presently, I like 4. I think you can make a case for maybe playing 3 in something like a main deck Agent of Treachery. But until I'm sure that's correct, I'm going to hedge a little bit and just stick with Hydroid Krasis. It's the cleanest thing you can play in this slot and ensures you always have more gas. And speaking of more gas, here is the biggest change to these Golos strategies, and it's a big one. It's Once Upon a Time. And I'm seeing a lot saying this card is somewhat overhyped, and I actually agree with that. I think Once Upon a Time is not as impactful as maybe people thought it was going to be in Standard. And that fits with what I thought of this card. I think it has specific homes. I think it's designed for decks that are looking for a pinch of early game consistency and can pay the 2 mana for this instant as you move through the late game. You can't play this in a deck that needs to spend all of its mana every turn. Green aggressive decks are not thrilled about Once Upon a Time. But this deck is, because Once Upon a Time does absolutely everything you need. Number 1, you can find your Arboreal Grazer on turn 0. That's a big deal. It guarantees you start the game with ramp. Number 2, you get to the late game. This is a fantastic, fantastic top deck. It finds all the pieces you're looking for when you've reached stalemate. It gets your Golos, it gets your Hydroid Krasis. And here's the big kicker, the synergy that really ties it all together. Now it gets your Wrath, because you can use Once Upon a Time to find Realm-Cloaked Giant. And when you're under extreme pressure, you cannot afford to not have your Wrath on a critical turn. Once Upon a Time ensures that happens so much more often. And that says nothing to the fact that it can just go get the lands you need in certain situations. Finding your Field of the Dead early on in the game, finding something like a Castle Vantress, all these cards matter a lot. Once Upon a Time is the glue that holds this deck together. It's what makes this archetype possible, and it's what makes it absolutely tier 1. I was pleased with my Esper Dance deck. I think it's a player in the metagame, but I think it's a tier 1.5 player. I think if people want to beat it, they will find ways to do so, and I think the format will adapt to it. This Golos deck feels more like a tier 1 deck. It's going to put some constraints on the format. It goes larger than everything else, and that is a big, big deal, especially early on in a format where you kind of just want to test the limit, see how far you can go. I think BANT Golos is very close to as far as you can possibly go and provides some of the best late games possible. Then, of course, we have Teferi. One common trend across these 2 decks, the Esper Dance deck and the BANT Golos deck. 4 copies of Teferi. This is still the best card in Standard. And I don't expect that to change. And I've heard people talk about maybe playing Oko in this slot. I quite frankly don't get it. Even when you play Teferi just minus and it dies immediately, it did what you wanted it to do. And you kept your card economy high. You slowed down your opponent's development. That's fine. You can take that result. But when Teferi survives and you're able to plus it, and now you have access to instant speed Circuitous Route with Field of the Dead on the battlefield. You have access to instant speed Wrath of Gods. Your opponent is in a nightmare situation. There's almost no good plays at that point. They're forced to make terrible attacks over and over, and Teferi just brings your deck to the next level. Play 4 copies of Teferi. It's very good in this deck. Moving on to our mana base. You see it takes up a lot of space because there's a lot of one-ofs in this deck. I don't want to go super granular through the details here. You see our counts, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the utility lands we have available. Plaza of Harmony is just a nice burst of life gain that Golos can find you in pinches. More frequently you will draw it naturally, and it just pads your life total a little bit, and you're totally fine with it. Since you do have your 4 Circuitous Routes to find all these gates, you will make sure you have access to many colors of mana. Plaza of Harmony also enables you to get 2 Golos activations in a single turn. It's rare that happens. You've probably won the game already at that point, but it's just something to keep track of, something you have access to. Moving on to this other set of utility lands, you see a little bit of scrying. You don't go too hard on the scry lands. You just want a few copies to give you good options when you get to the late game. But your real late game engine as far as your mana base goes is Castle Vantress. If you ever play to a point of parity and have Castle Vantress in play, you will run away with the game very quickly. And in a deck like BANT Golos, which has access to all the mana in the world, you will often activate Castle Vantress on your upkeep, be able to find something proactive to do on your turn, and very quickly seal the game. Just love this card in this deck. And a lot of times in control matchups, you're actually going to prioritize Castle Vantress over additional copies of Field of the Dead. I found situations where I already have 2 Field of the Dead. I cast a Golos as opposed to getting the third Field of the Dead, a lot of the times it's correct to just go get Castle Vantress. One other big utility land we've picked up is Fabled Passage. Fabled Passage not only fixes your mana here, but it's subtly powerful once you have your Field of the Dead going. The ability to generate your zombies at instant speed. Again, against control decks, this can be absolutely backbreaking. Plus, there's just the fact that you're getting 2 triggers off 1 land for Field of the Dead. And then there is, of course, the namesake land. Deck could not exist without Field of the Dead. This is a powerful, powerful Magic card. I think we all slept on it a little bit during M20 release. You only had to play against it a couple times to realize that this is kind of breaking the rules of Magic. Giving you free zombies. If it's free, it's me. That's a way to win games very easily. And any deck that's really trying to fight you on a resource axis just can't keep up with Field of the Dead. And I would include things like Esper Dance in that category. Eventually, Field of the Dead just overwhelms them. If you go watch my gameplay videos, you'll see I faced Carlos Romao twice. I faced him in Swiss. And in the finals, Carlos was playing Esper. I won both times. The games were mostly close, but eventually Field of the Dead just took over. And there was nothing Carlos can do. And I continue to see the BANT Golos decks having a good matchups against the Esper Dance deck. So if you're getting destroyed by Esper Dance on ladder, pick up BANT Golos. You'll get paid handsomely. Let's head over to the sideboard here. I've made some tweaks since the Fandom tournament. I think my sideboard was bad in Fandom, which is weird to say after having won the tournament. But I think I was accounting for decks that just didn't show up. And obviously in an 8-man field, it's challenging to cover everything, and you want to go a little bit broad. But the card that disappointed me most was Knight of Autumn. I saw this as a necessary concession to the mono-red Cavalcade decks, but I also thought it would be quite good against the Esper decks. It's not good against Esper. It's virtually unplayable in that matchup. I wouldn't be bringing in copies in that spot, but I still have 2 copies in my sideboard because I do think you need some way of interacting with aggressive decks a little bit earlier. And if anything weird pops up, Fires of Invention, stuff like that, Knight of Autumn could potentially be very strong. I'll move back up to the top here. You see just a counter magic suite that consists of Veil of Summer and Negate. And I do consider Veil of Summer counter magic because oftentimes it's countering either a removal spell or a discard spell. I think it'll become more important in the mirror as well. I expect people to pick up Agent of Treachery. I expect Unmoored Egos to tick up. Therefore, I may even play 3 copies of Veil of Summer and maybe go down on these 2 negates. These aren't really doing anything specific. You just want negate against decks that cast expensive non-creature spells, Esper included, the mirror included. I think there's a lot of spots where you do want to have negate in your deck, but you can also learn to function without it. And it could be we actually want to trend more towards Veil of Summer. Aether Gust. The best core right now in Standard is the Nissa, Mana Dork, Oko core. I think that's the starting point for Standard. And I still think these Simic decks are excellent, particularly Brad Nelson's build I thought was awesome with Brazen Borrower. Aether Gust is a way to interact with those decks at instant speed, which you'll really appreciate. You can just Aether Gust on their key turn a lot of the times. Like if they invest 5 mana into Nissa, you get it on the stack. And time walking them there really puts the game in a place where they can no longer catch up. And if you get time to set up your field engine, you can very easily overcome any value they generate with their planeswalkers. If each land you play is making 2 2/2s, it's very easy to block Nissa's tokens all day. So Aether Gust just buys us that little bit of time we might need. Also an option against the mono-red decks, controlling something like Torbran, the new red legend. You'll be very happy you have Aether Gust in that situation as well. Moving to a copy of Deputy Detention. Catch-all for the most part. I like it in the mirror. And just having 1 in your deck makes a big difference when you do have access to 4 once upon a time. You'll find it reliably. At that point, you're doing a lot of Teferi rebuys and just getting multiple activations out of your Deputy Detention. And that will be your setup in the mirror sometimes. But I also just like accounting for everything. I mentioned Fires before. Fires of Invention, just a powerful card. At some point, it's going to pop off. You want to be prepared for it. Unmoored Ego. Mirror Breaker. You get Field of the Dead, you are very far ahead in the mirror. If you get Dance against the Esper Dance decks, that's a very nice position to be in. And any other weird combo-y stuff that might pop off, you're ready with Unmoored Ego. Don't go too hard on this card. I don't know if you're supposed to use it against things like Feasting Troll King. You're almost certainly not supposed to use it against things like Phoenix. So be judicious with the use of Unmoored Ego. Don't go too hard into this just because it seems like it hits something that might go into the graveyard. Planar Cleansing, still accounting for those Simic decks that are flooding the battlefield with all their Nissas, all their many, many mana dorks. You'll be happy to have your one copy here. And the big change from my fandom list is the addition of 2 Agent of Treachery. This should have been in the sideboard from the beginning, quite frankly, but I do expect the mirror to pick up now, and in the mirror, you certainly want access to this card. A lot of times it'll be used to win the Teferi war. You just steal someone's Teferi, bounce your Agent of Treachery, get another activation out of it. But the first target is always going to be Field of the Dead. Just be conscious that I would expect Veil of Summer in the mirror at this point. So you need to be a little bit careful with your Agent of Treachery uses. You want to make sure you're getting max value out of that. And then there's the March of the Multitudes. This was a card that baffled some of the casters. They weren't quite sure what I was doing with it. I just wanted another instant speed threat against Esper decks. And I thought that should I reach the late game, I could also leverage March to put myself out of burn range against the red decks. In practice, it didn't come up. There was a game against Esper where had I drawn March of the Multitudes, I would have been thrilled. It would have been by far the best card in my deck. I just didn't draw it. So I haven't ever cast a March of the Multitudes with this deck yet. I still think the theory is sound. It's still holding that one slot in my sideboard for the time being. If you have something you really like and you need a sideboard slot, I do think you can consider cutting the March of the Multitudes, especially if we start to see the Esper decks trend downwards. That's going to about do it for this deck tech. If you enjoyed this, make sure you like, share, subscribe. Comment down below. Let me know what you think of this Golos deck. Do you think it's the truth, or is it just another flash in the pan? And make sure you stay tuned to the Arena Decklist YouTube page for all your deck tech needs.